it's been a bit of a shock. However much one tries to prepare oneself for something like this, it's still a dreadful shock, and we're still trying to come to terms with that, and it's very, very sad.
The diary had remained sealed since Prince Philip's death, protected by a handwritten instruction that no one was to open it before a date known only to his private secretary. But when King Charles finally broke the seal, one entry stopped him cold. It named Edward, described a promise made in private, and exposed a decision Charles believed his younger brother had deliberately concealed from the crown. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles stood over the open pages without speaking. Inside a locked cabinet at Windsor Castle, the royal residence west of London, the diary had rested beside a sealed envelope marked, "For the sovereign alone." That phrase meant the contents were intended only for the reigning king. Now those words felt like a warning aimed directly at him. The entry described a private agreement Philip had made with Edward over the future of the Duke of Edinburgh legacy. That title, once held by their father, carried responsibility for charitable work and family duties he wanted preserved after death. Whoever controlled that legacy would shape how Philip's service was remembered, and whether it remained personal or became absorbed into the crown. The king read the passage twice. Then he removed his glasses and placed them beside the diary with care. Anger rose first, but grief sharpened it. The language sounded unmistakably like Philip, firm, blunt, and final. His father had recorded that Edward promised to protect a family trust and prevent it from falling under the monarch's direct control. Worse, the younger brother had apparently kept that commitment hidden for years. Camilla entered after noticing the silence. She saw his face change, moved toward the desk, and asked what had happened. Charles closed the diary before she could read it. "This concerns Philip's sons," he told her. The queen consort, meaning the wife of the reigning king, understood the boundary immediately. She said nothing more, yet remained long enough to see his hand tighten around the sealed envelope. Charles opened it and found a folded memorandum bearing Edward's signature. A memorandum is a formal written record of an agreement, and this one proved the promise was not simply Philip's private wish. Edward had accepted it in writing. The king summoned his brother to Windsor at once. As Edward's car approached, Charles ordered every aide from the room and placed the signed page at the center of the table. But before Charles could demand the truth, he had to face the painful reality that Philip had trusted Edward with something he had never entrusted to his eldest son. Charles and Edward had mourned the same father, but they had never known the same man. To Charles, Philip had been a commanding presence, whose approval always seemed one achievement away. To Edward, he had become a quieter guide in later years, offering responsibilities rather than affection. The sealed entry reopened that old imbalance, turning a private promise into evidence of a wound neither brother had ever admitted. Charles carried the burden of those memories as he waited inside Windsor. From childhood, Philip's standards had shaped him through pressure, discipline, and constant expectation. The future monarch had been trained to inherit the crown, meaning the legal and symbolic authority of the reigning sovereign. Yet he often feared his father viewed sensitivity as weakness and hesitation as failure. Every duty completed had seemed to create another test. Every success had felt temporary. Edward had known a different version of Philip. Through their shared work with the Duke of Edinburgh's award, a youth program created to encourage service, skills, and personal development, the younger son had spent time beside a father who had grown calmer with age. Their bond had not been openly tender, but it had deepened through work. That difference now mattered because Charles could not stop wondering whether Edward had received the trust he had spent a lifetime trying to earn. Edward waited outside the private room without an aide. As the silence stretched, he remembered a difficult engagement years earlier when criticism had followed him home. Philip had placed one hand on his shoulder and said, "Do the work, not the performance." The memory steadied him, but it also filled him with fear. Those words had become a private rule between them, and the diary threatened to expose everything built around it. Charles watched his brother arrive and felt resentment move beneath his grief. He was not only angry about the hidden agreement, he was wounded by the possibility that their father had trusted his youngest son with a responsibility too sensitive to share with the future king. The door opened. Edward entered alone, and Charles did not offer him a seat. Neither man spoke. The signed memorandum rested beside the diary, and the younger brother's eyes moved toward it immediately. His face changed before he could control it. The king noticed. That single reaction confirmed what no denial could erase. Edward had known the document existed throughout the years since Philip's death. Charles pushed the paper forward. How long? Edward looked at the signature, then at his brother. He did not pretend confusion. He did not ask for time. You were never supposed to find it this way, he said quietly. Edward's words did not calm Charles. They forced him to ask what had happened years earlier that made Philip believe secrecy was necessary in the first place. The rupture had not begun with the diary. It began during a family ceremony years earlier, when a brief exchange behind closed doors convinced Philip that his final wishes could become vulnerable to palace politics. What appeared publicly as a moment of unity concealed a private disagreement over duty, inheritance, and control. And Edward's response that day became the reason Philip demanded a promise in writing. Charles remembered the gathering with painful clarity. It had followed one of Philip's final ceremonial appearances connected to the Duke of Edinburgh's award, a youth program built around service, skills, physical challenge, and personal growth. The family had returned to Windsor to discuss what would happen to the work after his death. The future king believed the answer was simple. Every major royal project should eventually sit beneath a central structure controlled by the sovereign, meaning the reigning monarch, who holds ultimate constitutional authority. Philip saw it differently. The older man placed a folder before Charles and Edward and said the younger son should personally safeguard an independent trust supporting the award. A trust is a legal arrangement created to protect money, property, or responsibilities for a defined purpose. Charles objected immediately. He argued that no royal legacy could exist beyond the authority of the future monarch. His voice remained controlled, but the meaning was unmistakable. One institution, one chain of command, no exceptions. Edward said almost nothing. Philip watched that silence harden across the room. Then he closed the folder, ended the discussion, and dismissed them both. Charles left believing the disagreement had been settled in his favor. Edward followed more slowly, trapped between obedience to his father and loyalty to the brother who would one day become king. The call came later. Philip summoned Edward back alone. No aides joined them. No official minutes were taken. According to the documented account Edward now gave Charles inside Windsor, his father placed the same folder on the table and demanded an answer. When the younger son hesitated, Philip warned him that silence could become cowardice when family duty was at stake. Edward signed. The pledge stated that the trust would remain protected from personal influence, including pressure from any future sovereign. That sentence changed everything. Charles now understood that his father had acted after he departed, creating a safeguard specifically against the kind of control he had proposed. The king felt the injury deepen. He had not merely been overruled, he had been excluded from the final decision. Edward then revealed the last detail through his private spoken account. Philip had added one verbal instruction that never appeared in the memorandum. The promise must remain secret, unless Charles attempted to take direct control of the trust. That condition transformed the diary from a record of the past into a challenge aimed directly at Charles, and the confrontation could no longer remain restrained. The door closed, the aides disappeared, and two sons of Prince Philip stood facing each other without ceremony, titles, or protection. Charles wanted a confession. Edward wanted his brother to understand why the promise existed. But the diary had already turned grief into accusation. And when Charles pushed the signed paper across the table, the argument stopped being about a trust and became a reckoning over loyalty. Charles demanded to know why the memorandum had never been disclosed after the accession. The accession was the moment he became king after the previous monarch's death, and from that day, every serious obligation affecting the royal family should have reached the sovereign's desk. To him, Edward's silence was not caution. It was defiance, hidden behind family loyalty. Edward held his ground. He explained that the trust had been designed to serve young people independently, free from changing palace priorities and personal influence. Philip had feared that once the work became another instrument of the royal household, its purpose would slowly bend toward image, control, and public relations instead of service. The king struck the table with the flat of his hand. The sound cut through the room. He accused his brother of using their father's memory as a shield, turning a dead man's wishes into protection against the crown. Edward flinched, but he did not step back. He answered that Charles was not truly furious about administration. He was furious because Philip had chosen another son to protect something important. Silence followed. Charles stared at him, wounded more deeply by the truth than by the accusation. Then he lifted the diary and read the line aloud. Edward understands that service survives only when vanity is kept outside the room. The monarch lowered the page. Did he believe I was vain? Edward took a breath before answering. He feared power would make all of us forget why the work began. The words landed hard. They did not accuse Charles alone, but he heard himself inside them. He heard years of pressure, rank, and expectation. He heard the fear that the crown could swallow the very duty it claimed to protect. Edward then revealed through his documented private account that 2 senior courtiers had already asked him to transfer the trust's authority to the sovereign's office. He had rejected both requests quietly, fulfilling Philip's condition without exposing the disagreement or publicly embarrassing his brother. Charles closed the diary. The restraint vanished from his voice. He declared that the trust's legal structure would now be reviewed. Edward understood the threat immediately: surrender the promise, or resist the king openly. Yet Charles's declaration did not settle who held the power, because Philip had placed safeguards around the promise that even the sovereign could not simply command away. Charles believed the crown could resolve the matter through a signature, a legal review, and a discreet change of authority. Philip had anticipated exactly that response. Buried beneath the emotional language of the diary was a carefully designed safeguard, one that prevented any monarch, courtier, or family member from taking control alone. Suddenly, the brother Charles had summoned for answers, possessed the one thing the king could not demand: independent authority. Charles listened as palace legal advisors explained the limits of his power. The trust's governing documents placed it outside the monarch's personal household, meaning it did not belong to the private offices, staff, or direct command of the reigning sovereign. That separation mattered, because royal instruction alone could not rewrite the structure. Philip had built the arrangement to survive pressure, succession, and even family anger. The king learned that a council of trustees controlled the final decisions. A council of trustees is a group legally responsible for protecting an organization's purpose and assets. Edward was not the owner. He was the guardian of the founding promise, charged with defending the trust's mission while sharing authority with others. No individual could quietly take control. Charles privately briefed William soon afterwards. The prince listened without interrupting, then turned Philip's memorandum over in his hands. His grandfather had not simply predicted disagreement. He had prepared for a clash between family loyalty and the crown itself. And that possibility visibly unsettled the future king. The monarch asked whether Edward had acted disloyally. William chose every word with care. He said secrecy had damaged trust, but destroying Philip's safeguard would damage something larger: the belief that royal service could exist without becoming personal power. Charles heard the warning, even if he did not welcome it. Edward sat alone after the confrontation and slowly removed his cufflinks. When Sophie joined him, he admitted that he might have lost his brother's confidence permanently. The trusted confidant reminded him that preserving a promise sometimes meant accepting the pain of being misunderstood. He answered that duty felt less noble when it cost the love of family. The legal note delivered the final blow. Philip had written that any attempt to dissolve the trust without unanimous approval would automatically transfer its administration to an external charitable body. That meant the legacy would leave royal influence completely, rather than submit to one person's control. Charles suspended the review. He could not risk losing his father's work altogether. But the anger remained. The king ordered Edward removed from the next family strategy meeting, replacing legal pressure with personal exclusion. Charles could not seize the trust, but he could make Edward feel the consequences inside the family. And those consequences began before the palace doors had even reopened. The fallout did not arrive through a public decree. It appeared as an empty chair. When senior members of the family gathered to discuss the monarchy's future program, Edward's place had been quietly removed. No explanation was circulated, and no announcement was made. But everyone in the room understood that Charles had answered resistance with exclusion, and Edward understood that protecting Philip's promise might now cost him his place beside his brother. Edward received the revised meeting list while preparing for an engagement. He read it once, then folded the paper with careful control. The closed family strategy session was meant to shape the monarchy's future program, meaning the duties, public priorities, and major royal work planned for the months ahead. His absence mattered because he had normally taken part in those discussions, especially when charitable responsibilities were involved. Now his chair had disappeared, as if his voice no longer belonged in the room. The younger brother asked his aide to continue the schedule. His words were calm, but his voice tightened. Minutes later, another message arrived, confirming that his private briefing with Charles had been cancelled without a new date. Palace officials were also told to route every matter concerning his charitable work through a senior secretary, creating a formal wall between the brothers. Sophie recognized the punishment immediately. She watched Edward complete the engagement without complaint, then saw the hurt return when they were alone. At home, he admitted that he had expected anger from Charles. What he had not expected was the deliberate erasure of his role. The trusted confidant reminded him that silence could preserve dignity, but she also warned that isolation could become its own kind of defeat. William noticed the empty chair as soon as the strategy meeting began. The prince asked whether his uncle would join remotely. Charles did not look toward the vacant place. "He has chosen another responsibility," the king replied. The answer turned a private promise into a public judgment within the family. William understood what had happened. His uncle was being punished not through law, but through belonging. Anne learned the deeper truth later through a documented private conversation preserved in Philip's personal papers. Their father had warned Edward that the greatest test would not be defending the trust from officials. It would be enduring rejection from his own brother without retaliating. That evening, Anne arrived without staff and without warning. She carried a second handwritten note from Philip, one neither Charles nor Edward knew still existed. The punishment had driven Edward into isolation, but Anne's arrival brought the one message capable of changing how both brothers understood Philip's final decision. Anne did not arrive as the Princess Royal, or as an intermediary for the crown. She came as Philip's daughter, carrying a note he had placed in her hands years earlier. With no aides, no record, and no palace machinery between them, Anne told Edward that their father had never intended the promise to divide his sons. He had created it because he feared grief and power would make them stop speaking honestly. Edward listened without interruption. Anne explained that Philip had always expected disagreement over his legacy because Charles saw continuity through the crown, while his younger brother saw it through personal stewardship and direct service. The crown, in this context, meant the authority and responsibilities attached to the reigning monarch rather than simply the person wearing it. Their father had understood both views, but he had feared neither brother would understand the other. Anne placed the folded note between them. Philip had asked her to keep it unless the dispute became personal, trusting his daughter to intervene only when pride threatened to destroy the family. She had waited because the instruction was clear. Now, after the exclusion, the silence, and the widening distance, waiting any longer would have meant failing him. The princess unfolded the page and read the recorded words exactly as written. "Do not let the institution become an excuse for my sons to abandon one another." Edward lowered his head. The sentence broke through the defense he had carried for years. He admitted that he had kept the memorandum secret, partly because he feared Charles would dismiss him as the youngest brother, clinging to borrowed importance. The promise had given him purpose, but it had also made him afraid that any explanation would sound like ambition. Anne did not soften her answer. She told him that silence had allowed Charles to discover the promise as a betrayal rather than receive it as an explanation. Protecting Philip's wishes did not excuse withholding the truth. Edward accepted that without protest. Then she revealed the note's final passage through the documented account in Philip's handwriting. Their father had chosen Edward not because he trusted Charles less, but because the elder son would already inherit the monarchy. The younger one needed a duty that could never be removed by rank, succession, or changing favor. Edward understood at last. The trust had never been a reward over Charles. It had been a responsibility created for him. He asked Anne to arrange one final meeting with the king. This time, he would not defend himself. He would offer the diary, the memorandum, and the entire truth without conditions. For the first time, Edward was prepared to surrender the secret, not the promise, and Charles would soon have to decide whether being king mattered more than remaining a brother. Before the brothers could meet again, the secret escaped Windsor. By sunrise, Philip's sealed diary was no longer a private family wound, but a national sensation. Broadcasters debated loyalty, newspapers declared a royal fracture, and crowds gathered outside palace gates, searching for meaning in a story they only partly understood. Yet one image captured the public mood: Edward continuing his duties, while the world questioned whether he had betrayed his king. Charles woke to a storm he could no longer contain. Details of the confrontation had reached the press, though the exact diary passage remained private. That gap mattered, because it allowed every version of the story to grow at once. Some reports framed Edward as a loyal son defending Philip's wishes. Others cast him as a brother who had hidden a binding promise from the sovereign. Palace communications staff struggled to produce a united response. The communications office, meaning the team responsible for official royal statements and media handling, could not deny the confrontation, because Charles refused to call the reports false. Edward also refused to discuss his father's private words. Their silence protected Philip, but it left the public free to fill the emptiness with accusation. A major newspaper delivered the image that defined the morning. Its front page showed Charles and Edward walking in opposite directions beneath the headline, "Philip's last secret divides his sons." Outside a Windsor cafe, television screens replayed the story while a silent crowd watched. No one knew the full truth, yet everyone understood the pain. Edward arrived at a youth awards event, determined to continue his duty. A reporter shouted, "Did you deceive the king?" He stopped, gripped the edge of his speech folder, and answered through a recorded press exchange, "I kept a promise to my father, but I should have trusted my brother with the truth." Charles watched the statement from his private office. Edward had been excluded, blamed, and exposed, yet he had not attacked the monarch. That restraint affected the king more deeply than anger would have. His brother had accepted responsibility without surrendering Philip's promise. William entered and urged his father to release a brief statement protecting Edward's integrity. The prince warned that silence was beginning to look like condemnation. Charles initially refused. Then his attention fell on the diary, still open at Philip's warning that pride could corrupt service. The king cancelled every remaining appointment that evening. He ordered Edward to return to Windsor, not for another confrontation, but for a meeting inside Philip's former study. The world expected a royal punishment, but inside the room that still carried Philip's influence, Charles prepared to deliver a verdict no headline had predicted. Charles placed Philip's diary between them one final time, but this time it was not evidence. It was a warning from a father who understood both sons more clearly than either had realized. Edward had been wrong to conceal the promise. Charles had been wrong to treat independent duty as disobedience. The monarchy could survive disagreement, but Philip's final lesson was that it would lose its soul if power destroyed trust. Charles met Edward alone in Philip's former study. No advisors waited outside, no legal papers covered the table, and no official titles stood between them. The king wanted the conversation to happen as brothers, because rank had already done enough damage. Edward understood that choice immediately, yet he still carried the full trust file in both hands. Edward placed the documents before Charles and explained every decision made since their father's death. The trust file was the complete legal and administrative record showing how Philip's wishes had been protected. He accepted responsibility for the secrecy, but he refused to apologize for preserving the trust's independence. The younger brother had hidden the truth, yet he had not betrayed the purpose behind it. Charles read the final page, closed the file, and pushed it back across the table. "Father gave this duty to you," he said. "I will not take it away." Edward lowered his head. Relief reached him slowly, almost painfully, because he had prepared himself for loss rather than mercy. The brother who had stood against the crown now realized the king was no longer trying to defeat him. Charles then admitted what the diary had awakened. Philip's confidence in Edward had reopened an old fear that the eldest son had disappointed their father. The monarch had mistaken that wound for authority and used power to silence the pain. Edward answered that Philip had demanded different things from each son because their burdens were never the same. One had inherited the crown, the other had been given a duty that could survive outside it. Edward apologized for allowing fear to become secrecy. Charles apologized for using exclusion as punishment and confirmed that his brother's place within the family would be restored immediately. The palace later issued a formal statement affirming Edward's continued guardianship of the independent trust. A formal statement is the monarchy's official public declaration, and this one recognized Philip's safeguards while confirming the king's full support. The diary had exposed neither disloyalty nor unworthiness. It exposed what pride, inheritance, and unspoken grief could destroy. Philip's final intervention forced both sons to confront their weaknesses, preserve his legacy, and choose brotherhood over control. And when Charles returned the diary to its cabinet, he did not reseal the bitterness inside it. He left beside Edward, carrying forward Philip's clearest command: that duty means nothing when love, trust, and family are sacrificed to protect power. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.